After many weeks of studying all the available photos, evidence, eyewitness testimony, and talking to people who grew up in Chelam in the 50s and 60s, I have come to my own forensic analysis of exactly what happened when the Porsche Spyder and the Ford two-door collided. Part of studying evidence and photos is not just looking at what you can see, but what you don't see. When I look at the photos of the crashed Porsche on the side of the road, the first thing that I don't see are skid marks across the pavement or tire marks across the dirt and grass. If the Spyder had spun around like some people have reported, there would have been skid marks across the pavement and tire marks across the dirt to where the 550 stopped. There is only one squiggly skid mark on the pavement where the Porsche may have collided with the Ford. The witnesses driving behind Jimmy and Rolf said they saw something or someone fly out of the Porsche into the air when the cars collided. They said they saw the Porsche spin to the right and roll over and over. When you look at the photos of the Porsche, you can see that the side of the car is not just crushed inward like hitting a telephone pole, but smashed inward and upward like a parallelogram. This is clear evidence that the car was initially impacted from the driver's side, but then flipped upward, launching Rolf out of the car. You also see in the photos of the Ford that the collision was not a glancing blow. If it was, the front wheel would have been peeled off, not forced back and inward toward the firewall. To push the wheel of the Ford inward, the energy from the impact had to be coming at the Ford from an angle. A glancing blow would have just peeled the skin off the Porsche instead of pushing all the metal into the car and the steering wheel into the passenger side of the car. Another fact that the photos show is that the rim of the Ford did not leave a gouge in the pavement like many people, myself included, have believed for 65 years. After studying the photos and zooming in, you can see that the gash in the pavement is actually from the inner fender or firewall body panel, not the wheel. It still indicates the same thing. The Ford spun around after the impact and then rolled backwards in an arc back towards the eastbound lane, proving that the crash happened in the westbound lane. The most misunderstood evidence of the crash photos is the skid marks, supposedly left by the Ford. It has been reported since the accident that the Ford skidded, rolled, and then skidded again. After many long hours studying all the photos, evidence, and witness testimony, I can tell you with 99.9% certainty that this is simply not true. I could be wrong, but please follow along with me. Witnesses behind the Ford and behind the Porsche both said that neither car hit the brakes or skidded. Supposedly, the Ford slowed down for the turn, but no brake lights were seen and no skidding was heard. 15-year-old Don Dooley was a passenger with his uncle in a truck about 50 yards behind the Ford. He testified that he did not see anything or hear skidding. He only saw the cars coming together. Mr. and Mrs. White were behind Jimmy when the accident happened. They were admittedly going around 65 to 68 miles per hour, and they said the Porsche passed them like they were standing still. They said they looked at their speedometer right away because the car passed them so fast. Mr. White said the silver Porsche had to be going at least 85 miles an hour. This was just about a mile before the crash on the long straightaway approaching the 41 junction. Mr. and Mrs. White said they never saw any brake lights on the Porsche either. All the witnesses from both directions said that the Ford was beginning its turn onto Highway 41 ahead of the turn. In fact, the Ford started turning so early that Mr. White had time to tell his wife, "Watch this." She lifted her head up in time to see the collision. Mr. White also said that Dean's car did not even slow down. All the witnesses said that the Ford started to make the turn and then turned back towards its own lane. The fact of the matter is, neither car ever hit their brakes. So what about the skid marks everyone claims to be from the Ford? Here is what I believe happened. The skid marks are from an earlier accident. Crashes occur at this junction many times a year, even to this day. If you study the photos, you can see that the skid marks begin, or end, in the westbound lane. They continue in one direction in a curved line with no indication that the car that left these marks ever changed direction. The Ford could not have left these marks because A, they don't match the testimony that the Ford started the turn and then turned back. B, the angle of impact inferred by these skid marks could not have produced the force it would take to push the front wheel of the Ford into the firewall. In other words, it would have been a glancing blow and the damage to the two cars would have been much different. Basically, the angle is wrong. C. The second set of skid marks is too close to where the Ford stopped to have been made by the Ford. D. If you look close, there is a third set of skid marks in line past where the Ford stopped. Bottom line is, there is just no way that the Ford could have made these skid marks. The evidence and witness testimony do not support in any way that these skid marks were from James Dean's accident on September 30th. To get an idea what might have caused these skid marks, you have to look at the surrounding evidence. The obvious skid marks from a dually truck can be seen easily. One thing you notice about these skid marks is that they appear to be curved like the shadow of a telephone line. This indicates that the highway undulates up and down. You can see this in other photos of the old highway. In fact, a friend of mine who grew up in Shalem told me that there was a dip just before the junction in the westbound lane heading west. In one photo, you can see dirt settled on the side of the road, indicating a low spot. If both roads are crowned for drainage, then there would be a low spot in the corner where the two roads meet. Even a 2 or 3 inch dip in the road would be significant in a 3-foot tall car at over 80 miles an hour. Not to mention that 550s are notorious for spinning on a track or at speed because of the light weight of the car and the engine being near the back. But if you look close, you notice a set of skid marks in the eastbound lane. They look like they are starting to turn onto 41, but then suddenly dart off to the right in a very acute angle. The only way for a car to make skid marks like this is if it is hit from the side or at an angle. Funny thing is, the skid marks that everyone says are from the Ford lead right up to where the eastbound skid marks suddenly make a sharp right turn. Actually, they line up perfectly and there are no other skid marks to explain the abrupt, almost 90-degree change of direction they make. Here's a visual example to help you understand. A car is stopped at the stop sign heading southwest. Another car is caught off guard by the stopped car and tries to go around, hitting its brakes near the stop sign in the opposite lane. The off and on skid marks are curving towards the westbound Highway 466. It impacts an oncoming car making the turn onto Highway 41. The skid marks are now explained. Bob's your uncle, and Hans shot first. So here's the accident sequence as I see it. James Dean and Donald Turnipseed approached the junction after both cars have just passed other vehicles. Turnipseed was a car guy, as displayed by his modified 1950 Ford, with two-tone paint, a new hood from a 1951 Ford, passing cars on the highway at high speed, and supposedly he replaced his stock intake manifold with a new performance manifold. As a hot rodder, Donald would have taken the turn north onto Highway 41 at the straightest angle possible. With a high center of gravity, the Ford would get lots of body roll if he turned late and made an arcing turn, as suggested by the skid marks I just spoke about. So Donald did what James Dean would do, or what I would do. He checked for oncoming traffic and started to make the turn onto 41 early so he could hit the apex, as they say in racing, and make the turn as fast as possible without rolling his car. Donald Turnipseed either did not see the Porsche or he thought it was farther away than it was. That is easy to do with a 3-foot tall car. I'm sure he certainly did not expect the Porsche to be traveling as fast as it was. When Donald sees the Porsche rapidly approaching, he turns back towards his own lane. This gives the correct angle and force of impact to explain the damage to both cars. In a reflex reaction, James Dean jerks the wheel to the right away from oncoming traffic and the Spider spins sideways. The two cars impact each other in a near T-bone collision. The Porsche Spider flips into the air, launching Rolf out of the car. The impact of the collision pushes the bumper, frame, and suspension downward and into the firewall of the Ford and pops off the front fender. The Spider flips over and spins in the air. The energy from the impact causes the rear of the Ford to lift off the ground and spin counterclockwise as it continues eastward down the road. The Porsche lands off the side of the road near the stop sign close to a telephone pole. The Ford lands backwards and then rolls in an arc back towards the eastbound lane. It all happens in an instant.